The barn smelled like dust and rain that never quite dried. I stood in the doorway with my flashlight shaking in my hand, because my hands shake now, they didn't used to. 73 years old and standing at the edge of a condemned building, waiting for morning light so men with machines could tear it down. I told myself it was just one night out of the wind. I found a corner that looked dry. I sat down on a crate that groaned under me, and I swept the flashlight across the wall to check for rot, for rats, for anything that might share the space with me. That's when I saw the first date. Painted in faded blue, high on the wood, March 1954. Beneath it, a name. Beneath that name, another date. I sat very still. The light moved further. More names, more dates. A row of small marks climbing the doorframe, the kind parents make when they measure how tall their children have grown. This wasn't a barn. Someone had lived their whole life inside these walls. I had nowhere else to be that night. So I decided to read. My name is Norma Whitfield, and until 8 months ago I had a small apartment above a shuttered hardware store, a recliner by the window, and a routine I never thought to be grateful for. Then the building sold. Then my savings ran out faster than anyone warns you they will. Then I learned what it means to carry your whole life in 2 bags. I'd spent the last months moving between a shelter, a cousin's spare room that stopped being available, and nights I don't like to talk about. When someone mentioned the old Hallwell barn, empty, scheduled for demolition at sunrise, I didn't think of it as sad. I thought of it as lucky. A roof, a wall between me and the wind. I never expected the wall to speak back. Before I go any further, I want to know something. Where are you watching this from tonight? Are you curled up somewhere warm, or is it late where you are and you can't sleep either? Tell me in the comments. It matters to me more than you'd think to know who's on the other side of this story. Because what I found on those walls that night didn't just belong to strangers anymore. It started belonging to me. The first name I found again and again was Eleanor. Eleanor Hallwell, painted in that same fading blue, sometimes just her name, sometimes a date beside it, sometimes a whole sentence written small and careful, like someone had been afraid of running out of wall. Eleanor, 6 years old today, she misses her father. I traced the letters with my fingertips. Someone had loved this child enough to record her, year after year, on wood instead of paper. Paper burns, paper gets lost in moves. But a barn stays standing, or it did, until tomorrow morning. I moved my flashlight lower and found the height marks I'd noticed earlier. 3 of them, climbing the doorframe like rungs on a ladder. EH at the bottom, small, the marks close together, a child growing the way children do in short, sudden bursts. And then nothing. No more entries after it. Just a date, and beneath the date, 1 word. Gone. Above Eleanor's marks, 2 more sets climbed higher, year after year, long after hers had gone still. TH and MH close in height, maybe a year apart, growing up and up the frame the way siblings do when one of them isn't there to grow alongside them anymore. I sat with that word for a long moment. I've buried people myself. I know what it costs to write a word like that and then stop, because you can't write anything else. I kept reading. The wall told me the family had come from somewhere else, a name I didn't recognize, some town back east that didn't exist on any map I knew. There was a drawing of a wagon, crude but careful, and beneath it, the year we left everything. There was a drawing of this very barn, half-built, with a note that said, "Papa says it will hold us all if we're patient." I thought about patience. I thought about how many nights I'd told myself the same thing, in shelters, in waiting rooms, in the front seat of my car when it was still mine. The temperature dropped as the night wore on, but I didn't feel it the way I should have. I was too busy following a family through their worst years and their best ones, written in paint on wood that had outlasted every one of them. I moved along the eastern wall next, where the boards were wider, older, and the paint had settled deeper into the grain, as if that section had been written on first, before anyone knew how much wall they'd need for a whole family's worth of living. There was a tally there, small marks in groups of 5, the kind you make when you're counting something too important to trust to memory alone. I counted them myself twice and came up with 183. I never found out what they meant. Some things stay private even after everyone who kept them is gone. Further down, closer to the floor, someone had drawn a small house, nothing more than 4 lines and a triangle roof, the way a child draws before they know houses are complicated. Beside it, in handwriting too careful to belong to a child, someone had written, "This is the house we will build when Papa's debt is paid." I don't know if they ever built it. I know the barn stood another 70 years in its place, which tells its own kind of story. There was a section near the back corner, harder to reach, where the writing changed, smaller, rushed. A different hand, I thought, though I couldn't be certain. It talked about a bad harvest, about a debt that kept growing no matter how hard anyone worked, about a decision nobody wanted to make. We are sending Thomas to his aunt's, just until things turn around. He doesn't understand why. I don't have the words to make him understand. I put my hand flat against the wood, right over those words, the way you might put a hand on someone's shoulder. I don't know why. It felt like the only thing to do. I stayed in that corner a long time. I found myself wondering about the aunt, whoever she was, and whether Thomas ever forgave the parents who sent him away to save him, and whether forgiveness was even the right word for a boy too young to understand the difference between being sent away and being sent to safety. I've made decisions like that myself, though on a smaller scale. Decisions that look like abandonment from one side and love from the other. I understood that wall better than I wanted to. Further along, the tone shifted again. Lighter. A note about a wedding. A note about a baby born in the spring. Healthy, loud, thank God loud. A note about the barn roof being repaired finally, after years of buckets catching rain in the corners. Life had gone on. It always does, whether we're ready for it or not. Near the wedding notice, someone had pressed a flower into the wood itself, so old now it had left only a pale ghost of its shape, a stain in the grain where petals used to be. I touched it, and it crumbled slightly under my fingertip, 60 or 70 years of holding its place finally letting go because a stranger came along and dared to reach for it. I found myself talking out loud to the walls, which is the kind of thing you do when you've been alone too long and too often. I asked Eleanor if she'd made it out. I asked whoever wrote about Thomas whether he ever came home. The wall didn't answer, of course, but near 2 a.m, my flashlight caught something I'd missed. A name, written larger than the others, near the doorway, as if someone had wanted it to be the first thing you saw when you walked in, or the last thing you saw when you walked out. Whoever finds this, remember us. We were here. We mattered. I sat back on my crate and I cried, which surprised me because I don't cry easily anymore. Not after everything. But something about being asked to remember by people who'd been gone longer than I'd been alive undid something in me I thought had gone quiet for good. I spent the rest of the night going wall by wall, corner by corner, writing down every name and date I could find in the small notebook I still carried out of habit, the same one I used to make grocery lists in a life that felt like someone else's now. Eleanor Hallwell, Thomas Hallwell, Margaret Hallwell, a grandmother named Ruth who'd apparently kept bees behind the barn because there was a whole panel dedicated to her, complete with a drawing of a hive and the words, "Grandma Ruth's honey cured everything, even Papa's bad moods." I laughed out loud at that one. Alone, at 3 a.m, in a condemned barn. I laughed anyway. Somewhere past 3, I found the last panel, tucked behind what must have once been a workbench, low to the ground, easy to miss unless you were on your knees the way I was by then. It was a list of names, no dates at all this time, just names stacked one on top of the other, growing more modern as they went, the handwriting shifting from careful cursive to something closer to my own generation's scrawl. Whoever kept this wall alive hadn't stopped in 1954. They'd kept adding to it for decades, quietly, faithfully, long after the rest of the family had likely forgotten the barn existed at all. I wondered, kneeling there with my knees aching against the cold dirt floor, whether that person had known this day would come. Whether somewhere in the back of their mind, as they added one more name in the dark, they understood that eventually the barn would fall and someone, anyone, would need to have read it first. I like to think they did know. I like to think they were writing not just for themselves, but for whoever might be kneeling exactly where I knelt decades later, in the dark, with nowhere else to sleep and nothing left to lose by paying attention. It occurred to me, somewhere in that hour before dawn, that I had spent most of my adult life afraid of being forgotten myself. Afraid that when I went, whatever apartment I'd lived in would simply be repainted, rented out, and my name would vanish from it as if I'd never once made coffee in that kitchen or fallen asleep in that chair by the window. I understood, kneeling in front of that last panel, that this fear wasn't unique to me. It was the oldest fear there was. And here was a whole family who had found a way to answer it, one painted name at a time. By the time the sky outside started to lighten, grey at first, then that pale gold that comes before real morning, I had pages full of names. And one name stopped me cold because I recognised it, not from the wall. From town. Margaret Hallwell. There's a woman who runs the little flower shop on Independent Street, grey-haired, kind eyes, always slips me a free carnation when I walk past, even though she has no reason to be kind to a woman who looks like she sleeps where she can. Her name is Margaret. Margaret Hollis now, married name, but I'd heard once, in passing, that Hollis wasn't the name she was born with, and that she'd been named for her own grandmother, a woman she barely remembered except in stories. I sat very still in that grey light, staring at a wall that had just handed me something I didn't know how to hold. The MH on this wall couldn't be her. The dates were too old, the child too young, decades before our Margaret was ever born. But a name doesn't have to belong to the person carrying it now for it to matter. Sometimes it's carried forward precisely so it won't be lost. If I was right, the woman who gave me flowers for nothing had a whole family living inside these walls, and she had no idea this barn even existed, let alone that it was ours from being turned to splinters and dust. Silence. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the light through the cracks in the wall turned from grey to gold, long enough that somewhere outside I heard the first truck engine start, low and patient, the sound of men getting ready for a job they didn't know had already changed. I stood up, my knees complained the way they always do now. I looked at that wall one more time, at Eleanor and Thomas and Grandma Ruth and her bees, at the height marks and the wedding notes, and the word gone written so small it looked like it was trying to disappear. I took out my phone, the one thing I'd refused to sell no matter how bad things got, and I began to photograph every panel, every name, every date, working fast now because the trucks were closer and the light was better, and I understood all at once that I was the only person alive who knew this story existed. My hands weren't steady. Half the photographs came out blurred, and I had to stop, breathe, and take them again, because I understood, without anyone telling me, that this was the only chance anyone would ever get. There would be no second visit. There would be no barn standing tomorrow for me to come back and check a detail I'd missed. Whatever I captured in these next minutes was all that would survive. I photographed until my battery warned me it was dying. I photographed the doorway last. That line meant for whoever found it. We were here. We mattered. I said out loud to an empty barn about to become rubble, "I hear you. I'll make sure someone else does too." Silence. The foreman found me 20 minutes later, sitting on an overturned bucket outside, notebook in my lap, phone clutched in my hand like it held something precious, because it did. He looked at me the way people look at someone they assume is trouble. I understood that look. I've gotten it plenty since I lost my apartment. But I didn't move when he told me to. I asked him for 10 more minutes. Something in my voice must have carried the night I'd just had, because he gave them to me. I used those minutes to write down everything I remembered that hadn't fit on film. The shape of the handwriting, the way certain names had been traced over again and again, as if someone came back to them year after year, needing to touch them one more time. Then I stepped back and watched 100 years of somebody's life get pulled down in under an hour. It's a strange thing, grief for people you never met. But I felt it anyway, standing in that field with dust in my throat, watching wood that had held so much memory collapse into a pile that meant nothing to anyone but me. I stood there long after the trucks had gone quiet, long after the dust had settled over what used to be a doorway, a wall, a whole recorded life. I thought about how strange it was that I, of all people, had been the one standing there. A woman with no house of her own, given the last hours of someone else's. I didn't understand it then. I'm not sure I fully understand it now, but I knew I couldn't walk away and let it end in a pile of splinters with nobody the wiser. I found Margaret that same afternoon. I almost didn't go. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was a woman with no address trying to hand strangers their own history, that she'd think I was confused, or worse, that she'd think I wanted something from her. But I went anyway, because the wall had asked to be remembered, and I'd promised. I sat across from her in the back of her flower shop, surrounded by buckets of carnations and roses, and I showed her the photographs one by one on my phone's cracked screen. I watched her face change when she saw the name Eleanor. I watched it change again, further, when she saw the word gone and the date beside it, because she told me very quietly that her grandmother, the Margaret Hallwell she'd been named for, had a sister who died young, a sister the family almost never spoke of, a sister named Eleanor. She held the phone with both hands like it might slip away from her. She asked me, in a voice much smaller than the one she uses to sell flowers, whether the barn was still standing. I had to tell her no. I had to tell her it was gone by the time the sun was fully up, that I was the last person to walk those floors and read those walls, that everything left of her family's whole early life now existed only in the photographs on a stranger's dying phone. She cried. I didn't try to stop her. Some things deserve to be cried over properly. Silence. We sat together a long while after that, an old homeless woman and a flower shop owner, passing a phone back and forth between us, piecing together a family neither of us had known that morning, but both of us carried by afternoon. She stopped more than once on the panel with the height marks, pressing her finger gently to the screen over the initials near the top, the ones that simply stopped. She told me she'd never once heard her grandmother speak of a sister. Not at holidays, not at funerals, not even in the confused, half-remembered stories her grandmother told at the very end, when most of what she said no longer made much sense. Some grief, Margaret said, gets buried so deep it never surfaces again in words. It only survives in walls if you're lucky enough to have walls that remember for you. Margaret asked me why I'd bothered, why a woman with nothing had spent her one safe night documenting someone else's ghosts instead of sleeping. I told her the truth. I told her that when you've lost as much as I have, you start to understand exactly how much a name matters, how much it costs a person to be forgotten completely, with no one left to say they existed at all. I couldn't give her family the barn back, but I could give her back the names. She didn't let me leave with nothing that day. She gave me a job in the shop, sweeping, arranging deliveries, whatever these old hands could still manage, and she found me a room above the store, small, but mine for as long as I need it. She says it's payment for what I did. I say it's more than I ever expected to receive again in this life. I still have those photographs saved in 3 different places now, because I never want to risk losing them again. Sometimes, in the evenings, Margaret and I sit together and go through them slowly, one panel at a time, and she tells me what she's learned since, filling gaps with stories her own mother once mentioned in passing. She's begun writing it all down properly now, in a notebook of her own, so that whatever happens to the photographs, the story itself will survive in at least one more form, passed from a barn wall to a stranger's phone to a granddaughter's careful handwriting. The barn is gone. The field where it stood is just dirt now, waiting for whatever comes next. But Eleanor's name still exists. Thomas's does too. Grandma Ruth and her bees, the wedding, the baby born loud in spring, all of it survives, not on wood anymore, but in a phone, in printed photographs, in a woman's memory that had almost lost her own history for good. I came to that barn with nothing, looking only for a night out of the cold. I left it carrying something I never expected to find again at 73 years old. A purpose. Silence. I think about those words on the doorway often. We were here. We mattered. I understand now why someone wrote them, and I understand why I couldn't walk away once I'd read them. Because at my age, with everything I've lost, I know exactly how much it means to be remembered by even one person. So let me ask you something before I go. Is there a story in your own family, something written down, something someone's kept in a drawer or a box that you're afraid might be forgotten if you don't ask about it soon? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know. And if this story moved you tonight, stay a while longer. There are more like it here, more walls with stories waiting to be read, more people who were almost forgotten until someone stopped long enough to listen. Subscribe if you'd like to keep listening with me. I'll be here. I always am.